We're here live in Washington, D.C. with nearly 100 leaders of the Reform Jewish movement representing the various leadership bodies and entities of Reform Judaism. And we have two distinguished and honored guests who are joining us today as we do this election debrief. On one side of me is Vanita Gupta, who is the president of the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. And on the other side of me is Derek Johnson, who is the president of the NAACP. We are so thrilled and honored to have Vanita and to have Derek with us. I am particularly grateful to them as I sit on the boards of both the Leadership Conference and the NAACP, which is a great gift to be able to represent all of you in the Reform Jewish movement on those boards. The Commission on Social Action is the social justice entity of Reform Judaism. We have 3 jobs on our commission. We set policy for our movement. We then set strategies for how we can advance those policies throughout the United States and Canada and the world. And then we take leadership around how to effectuate those strategies. And so we're here for a 3-day meeting to debate and discuss, to study enduring Jewish values and texts, to apply them to issues of our day, and then to develop the strategies to make sure that our values live in the public square. And for those that don't know, we are streaming this live, in addition to the 100 or so people in the room, to hundreds and hundreds of Reform Jewish leaders across our movement, thanks to our partners at the Women for Reform Judaism. There are some folks from WRJ who are here in the room today. I know there are some folks from WRJ who are watching online. We're very grateful to WRJ for investing in our technological capacity. So hopefully the technology of this live stream will work so that WRJ, you can actually see how we are reaching our movement through the technology of YouTube, live stream, and other social media channels. So without further ado, we want to take an opportunity to frame our conversation with Derek and with Vanita. I'm going to introduce them briefly, then I'm going to frame the conversation, and then as quickly as we can get into the work of the conversation, which is to hear from Vanita and Derek about what this election will mean for us and for our issues. First of all, Vanita Gupta is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She previously was serving as the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General and head of the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, where she advanced constitutional policing and criminal justice reform. She also prosecuted hate crimes and human trafficking, promoted disability rights, protected the rights of LGBTQ individuals, and ensured voting rights for all. She combated discrimination in education, housing, employment, lending, and religious exercise. She graduated magna cum laude from Yale and received her law degree from NYU School of Law, where she also taught civil rights litigation clinics. Derek Johnson is the president and the CEO of the NAACP, the nation's largest and oldest civil rights organization. He is a longtime activist and leader who has led critical campaigns for voting rights and equitable education. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, Derek founded One Voice Incorporated to improve the quality of life of African Americans through civic engagement, training, and initiatives. He has also served as the vice chairman of the NAACP Board of Directors and as state president for the Mississippi State Conference, NAACP. Born in Detroit, Derek attended Tougaloo College and has a law degree from South Texas College of Law. He has served as an annual guest lecturer at Harvard Law School. Please celebrate and welcome Derek Johnson and Vanita Gupta. So, we heard many times during the course of this election campaign that this would be the most historic and important election of our lifetimes. We know that to be true. The Reform Jewish movement is deeply proud that we leaned into that with an unprecedented effort, a civic engagement campaign. We had as our goal that we would engage 100,000 voters, and we're proud to report that when all is said and done, we're still hearing from the field, we successfully engaged 140,000 voters in this election. We did that, you can definitely celebrate that. We did that as 1,000 communities in 43 United States participated. We registered more than 3,000 new voters. We organized 21 candidate fora. We had 8,000 college student leaders who were part of this wave of unprecedented engagement of first-time and young voters. So let's celebrate that leadership. Our youth led the way on our college campuses, but also in 7 Nifty events, 9 URJ camps, hundreds of teens and young adults across our movement. It led to the record turnout that we're seeing. And we also, of course, saw record participation and victories by women, candidates of color, and Jews. Exciting wins on ballot initiatives from around issues like restoring voting rights to former felons, protecting trans Americans, gun violence prevention, and important economic justice ballot initiatives. We were disappointed from all of our friends in Ohio. We lost on issue 1, which would have invested in drug treatment and prevention programs, but our Ohio folks are already strategizing about how to move this important work through the legislative process. Now, with Democratic control of the House and stronger Republican control of the Senate, there's lots of questions about what this will mean for our agenda. Deeply rooted in the biblical injunction, 36 times, 36 ways we're told to welcome the stranger because we were slaves in Egypt. We are doubling down on our commitments to immigration, to criminal justice reform, to gun violence prevention, LGBTQ rights, and a variety of other issues like climate change and reproductive choice. So we're going to start our conversation by asking Vanita and Derek just to open with 10 minutes or so each of some reflections on the election, what it means, and then we have a series of questions that I'll pose to them, and then we'll open the questions both to folks who have logged on through the internet and folks who are here in the room. So without further ado, I'd love to hear from Vanita.
Great. It's great to be here with all of you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to, 1 second. So I just want to say thank you to Rabbi Pesner for his leadership throughout the past many, many months. He has been an incredible leader and member of the Leadership Conference. The Religious Action Center is such an important member. And of course, Derek and the partnership with the NAACP, which is really at our founding at the Leadership Conference. So it's an honor to be here with both of you. I think there's really no question about just how historic the midterm elections were. And there was so much work, and I really think the work of the Religious Action Center in mobilizing people all over the country for the kind of values and for the kind of America we want and deserve was so historic as well. And you can give us some perspective on that as we move forward. But I want to celebrate them because I think that there's a lot of punditry that's going back and forth about whether there were wins and whether there were losses and who won and who lost. But we have to understand that Americans, by a very wide margin in this midterm election, came out for civil and human rights. And it was an important moment for us to be doing that. Civil rights voters in Florida restored the right to vote to 1.4 million Floridians. Okay, that is the largest expansion. That is the largest expansion of the suffrage since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. That is huge. And now the work to implement it and to make sure that everyone who is eligible to have their rights restored knows how to do it, can access it, and is going to become a voter in the next election is incredibly important as well. We now had civil rights voters in Maryland, in Nevada, in Michigan, who expanded access to the ballot. There were several states that demanded fair elections by taking out politics out of the redistricting process in a handful of red states. And then you had Chris Kobach, who was an architect of the voter suppression machine and a lot of anti-immigrant legislation around the country, who lost his gubernatorial bid in Kansas. That was also a big deal. These are huge wins at the micro level and the macro level for the integrity of our democracy, and there's a lot to celebrate. Massachusetts upheld civil rights principles for transgender people. Louisiana, it's kind of, you forget, but Louisiana ended a Jim Crow era law that was still in existence that allowed for people to be convicted of felonies with non-unanimous juries. Okay? There are very few places in this country where that was the case, and Louisiana finally ended that in this election. Medicaid expansion set to grow by about 500,000 people after voters in 3 deeply red states, Nevada, Utah, and Idaho, voted to expand health care coverage. And these victories happened against a backdrop of historic wins and milestones for our country. For the first time in our nation's history, 100 women will be in Congress in the next Congress, okay? 100. Now we know know we still have a lot of work to do, but the fact that that is both a milestone, and it was a milestone that was achieved, was a big deal, especially given how many women historically turned out both as candidates and as voters in this past midterm. We elected our first openly gay governor in Colorado, our first Democratic Latina governor. We elected the first 2 Muslim women to Congress and the first 2 Native American women. And a record number of people of color, including African Americans, were elected across the country. And so I think that this election really reflects what's a profound truth in America today, which is that we can embrace love over fear, unity over division, and fight for an inclusive, just, and fair democracy, because everything was at stake with this election. But look, we also know that there were great disappointments in this election. Elections where people had poured their hearts and souls for very progressive elected candidates that stood up for our values. And right now, in the days, and most recently in the last 24 to 48 hours, there are several important recounts that are happening. In some places, counts, because let's not forget there are places in this country where people's votes, predominantly African American and Latino voters, did not have and have not had their votes counted yet in Georgia and parts of Florida. And so there is a massive effort in this midterm election. We don't know fully what the results are, but that is work that we are deeply committed to at the Leadership Conference. The whole coalition has been very, very concerned about the emergence and reemergence of very pernicious voter suppression efforts all over the country. And this is work that we have to continue to fight for, because all of the different kind of nefarious ways in which voters, and voters of color in particular, are having their votes suppressed through voter purging, through restrictive voter ID laws, through the kinds of actions that Brian Kemp engaged in Georgia to really place voters in limbo, have them question whether their votes would actually be counted, and dissuading them from coming to the polls. This is part of our affirmative agenda moving forward. We have to, as a community that is committed to an open democracy that needs to work for everyone, need to commit ourselves to an affirmative voting rights agenda that involves enacting automatic voter registration, same-day registration, restoring the Voting Rights Act that really was gutted by the 2013 decision by the Supreme Court. We have long-term fights, and we know that right now, while there is one chamber of the House that is going to be very focused on oversight, and for the first time providing meaningful oversight to an executive branch that has largely been without oversight for the last 2 years. We also know that we need to make strides on building momentum for the kinds of civil rights goals that we have and for the kinds of values that we want to have America represent. And leading into this midterm election, and I'll wind down here because I know we have, I want to hear from Derek and we've got room for questions. The events in Pittsburgh and the events, the crushing, tragic, horrendous, and horrific events in the weeks leading into the election, I think were really a very sobering reminder to all of us about what's at stake right now. And we know that progress in this country has never been inevitable, and that our democracy and the values we represent have just never protected themselves. It has been up to all of us, as our federal government has increasingly kind of taken itself out or represented a different voice in America, that it has been up to all of us to defend our progress, which has been fragile and painstaking, and to make sure that we can actually advance and protect the most vulnerable communities amongst us. And that is the work that we have ahead. So even if there's still going to be a lot of struggles and challenges, we know that there's oversight, that we have to fight the long game and build power and public will for the kinds of values that we want and the kinds of policies we want. And we've got to be in this for the long game, even as we engage voters locally, as we engage them up and down the ballots in every election that we have, that we are able to push for policies in coalition. Because in the end, the coalition that you see represented up here is the only thing that is going to produce the wins that we want for the America we deserve. So thank you.
Thank you, Benita. We're so grateful to be in partnership with the Leadership Conference. And so we've got to remind people of the history that the Leadership Conference was housed in the offices of the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism. So we're deeply connected. And that Voting Rights Act that we refer to was, of course, drafted in part in our conference room. And I want to acknowledge Rabbi Gail Pomerantz from Miami, who was one of our lead organizers on our effort as part of Amendment 4 in Florida. So we're very proud. And Terry Yaffe, somewhere back there in Massachusetts, because we also leaned into this trans protection ballot initiative in Massachusetts, which will make history in our country as we protect trans rights. So without further ado, Derek, would you share some reflections for us?
Sure. Thank you, Rabbi Benson, for inviting me. And it's not a lot I can add outside of what Benita said in terms of just the raw numbers. For us, we've seen this as a successful election. Most importantly, because it restores the checks and balances in Congress. Anytime you have a divided government, you have an opportunity to make sure there's not a runaway train like we've seen this past 2 years. The loss in civility in the public discourse is disheartening, to say the least. It's a trend we began to see progress from 2007 forward. And the dynamic of Trump in the White House is only the icing on the cake, and we cannot forget that Trump is only as strong as Fox News have allowed that type of divisive voice to remain in our public discourse. It's a broken system. We must recognize what is taking place both in Florida and Georgia in terms of our election systems. That is a real problem when you have individuals who sit in power, overseeing elections, also on the ballot, also denying individuals access to the ballot. I live in Mississippi. We've seen this game time in and time out. I understand what this looks like. And as a result of that, for us, moving forward, we need to look at our elections in terms of an issue of national security. Anytime there are allegations of a foreign nation interfering in our elections, anytime you have individuals who are able to oversee elections in a way in which some communities are provided more access than others or denied access compared to other communities, we have a problem with our democracy. And so where this election was a success, with the many metrics that Benita laid out, we must operate with as much caution as possible over the next 2 years, because 2020 will be looking us in the face. We cannot afford another demagogue in the White House. It wouldn't do any of us any good. Also with this election, I want to help us figure out how do we cut through the noise. There's a lot of noise leading up to this election. It was fascinating but not surprising to see the day after the election results that the Attorney General was fired. And there was all this noise against the reporters to deflect from the victories that had taken place. But this administration is really, really, really gifted at distracting. Every 3 hours there's another major news story. And as a result of that, it forces many of us in the progressive community to jump around in ways in which it's hard for us to stay focused, because every 3 hours it is a serious matter. And 2 weeks ago, for me, I had to step back. I was actually scheduled to be in Louisville the day after the unfortunate shooting. A shooting that took 2 individual lives, but that shooting could have been much greater because that shooter went to an African-American church, and fortunately the doors were locked. There were 70 parishioners in the church for Bible study that night, only to be followed by Pittsburgh on that Saturday. And that was all in the backdrop of bombs being placed in the mail. We are in a dangerous time. And so for organizations like ours that are progressive-minded, progressive-leaning, and represent voices that many in this country would prefer not to hear, we have to be even more aggressive despite the victories that we've seen over this election cycle. And so when you think about Florida, you think about Georgia, no matter what takes place, 2020 political map will be completely different. The turnout in those 2 states alone was historic. When you add 1.4 million people on the rolls in Florida, that means our opposition will be even more aggressively against some of the things we stand for and our places of worship. So we have to be cautious with that. When you think about Georgia, there was, for many years, there was one national party platform, and one party wouldn't participate. But when you bring balance into the conversation, there is a level of fear that's born in the South that creates a danger for many of us in the organizations we represent. Because when Georgia becomes competitive, and North Carolina is competitive, and Florida is competitive, then the political landscape shifts, and the demagoguery that we've seen will only progress. In many southern states like Mississippi, where I live, policy is driven by race, by religion, by region. And fear-mongering is in the center of those 3 things. If there's a good policy, Affordable Care Act, call it Obamacare so you can drive the conversation around race. If there is a question around privatizing anything dealing with our pension funds, drive the questions around same-sex marriage or the women's rights to choose. That's a morality question. And from there, you get people to turn out against their interests. Over the next 2 years, you're going to see the tools of race, religion, and region, South versus North, or however the regional conversation play out, it's going to get even more progressive. So we celebrate the victories and the opportunities that this past election provided us. We have to be even more cautious about the next step and the loss of civility in our public discourse. The final thing I want to talk about is compassionate policy making. Compassionate policy making is something that we all care about. Are we providing support for our elderly? Do we create a space for our young people to have right opportunities in our policy? And do we protect the right of the disadvantaged, however we define disadvantage? That's compassionate policy making. But for many people, it's around profit before people. And so all of the distractive noise that's going on in the public discourse, that's the competing interest. The compassion of caring for your neighbor or the opportunity to maximize your profit. And for the NAACP, we can clearly understand the victory of the Voting Rights Act, but we also see the limitations of the Voting Rights Act. It was a compromise bill. A bill that NAACP and IRAC and many others fought so hard to get passed, but it was a compromise bill. We need to move beyond just that discussion and talk about 4 foundational things I believe will open up democracy. 1, should we go to a system similar to compulsory voting like Australia and 200 countries around the world currently have? Part 2, why do we have a system of voter registration? Let that marinate for a minute. It within itself is a vote suppression method. Part 3, restrictive polling places. Why should someone get off work, drive past 3, 4, 5 polling places to cast a ballot when we vote early, they're able to vote in centralized locations? And then thirdly, why would we have voting only on one day, a work day, for 12 hours? So many of our states, they don't provide early voting, and they only contain it within 12 hours. We need to open up voting so it can be on a holiday or weekend and over a period of time if we truly want democracy to work. And if we get democracy to work, we can change the public discourse and bring civility back into the reality of how we have more compassionate policy making that reflect the needs and interests of the many groups that we represent. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to
Thank you both so much. We're going to ask a few questions, and we'll open it up. I want to stay in voting rights for a second in democracy, remembering that not only, of course, is the Reform Jewish Movement a nonpartisan entity who would work with both sides of the aisle, but is about exactly what you described, President Derek Johnson, around voting rights and democracy. My predecessor and mentor, Rabbi David Saperstein, who's here, would remind us that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were actually passed by bipartisan majorities and reauthorized into law, and the Voting Rights Act by Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. Somehow voting rights became partisan. So one question is, what's the next forefront of voting rights in America? And this is a great way to really be nonpartisan and just about being democracy. One of the things we saw in the campaign in Florida was our congregations were able to come together and get over some of the polarization, because this actually brought more conservative people and more liberal people together for the sake of democracy. So what do you think the next chapter in voting rights looks like, and how we can strengthen democracy? You started, Derek, with some prescriptions. Is it state ballot initiatives? Is it, what's the strategy in your mind?
Well, for me, I think election of our voting system should be a matter of national security. There will be a bill coming out of the House, Homeland Security, to address that. We should not have such inconsistent systems from state to state that are widely compromised, and there's no way to verify the intent of voters. And in some states, there's no way for an individual voter to verify whether or not their true intentions were expressed in the casting of the ballot. That level of inconsistency is a national security issue. Part 2, we should not allow individuals to roll out the system in a very inequitable way. I like your political beliefs over here, So I'm going to provide you the maximum access, but I don't like your political beliefs over here, so I'm going to make it more difficult for you to participate. Thirdly, voting should be something that's really, really accessible in terms of ascertaining the final count. Let marinate for a minute. There is no reason why we are operating our systems where it can take upwards of 2 weeks before we figure out what the final count is. You know, we had 2000, I mean, the year 2000 in Florida was the example. And the very same things we're looking at from 2000, we're dealing with some of the same counties in 2018 because we never truly fixed the issue. We had a good bill, Help American Vote Act, that had some good components in there, and then corporate interests got in there, and Diebold was able to drive the conversation so that many of the states adopted their voting machines and they maximized their profit. It did nothing to truly solve the problems we seen during the 2000 election. So moving forward, the reform must be broader than the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act was important because if Section 5 was still in place, the very jurisdictions we're seeing the biggest problems were previously covered jurisdictions, meaning that those jurisdictions could not have changed their practices, their policies, or procedures without pre-clearance. But because there was no pre-clearance, the very same jurisdictions began to change all types of things, from closing polling locations, changing hours, all of the things you would think would be unfair and unjust in a just society, but yet it happened.
Thank you. Vanita, would you like to offer some thoughts about the next chapter of voting rights?
I mean, just building on what Derek said, I think that there's actually been, so remember that as recently as 2006, which was the last time that the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized, it was done so in a unanimously bipartisan way. And it's hard to imagine, given how politicized and weaponized voting rights has become now in the national conversation. And so what I think, though, still is really gratifying is that we've seen tremendous momentum at the state level for election reform and voting rights. And not everywhere, because we still have a regressive agenda, but I think that it would be incumbent on all of us and all of you that are out in your communities and in your states working to build power for the kind of national reform that we want, that Derek just mentioned. It matters that there's now, I think, 13 or 14 states that have automatic voter registration. And that goes to Derek's point. Why is it that the default in this country requires that somebody affirmatively register to vote, whereas automatic voter registration creates a default that if you're 18 and you come into contact with a social service or government agency, you are automatically registered to vote, and the default will be that you have to take affirmative steps to deregister if that's what you choose to do. And that sends a message about what kind of values we put on voting. But there are now, and these are the states that have enacted automatic voter registration have done so really in the last 3 to 4 years, red and blue states. So there is actually momentum, and we need to make it, there's this tipping point theory that once you get to around 20 to 25 states, that it becomes a lot easier for the feds to actually enact national federal legislation on this. There has been an AVR bill introduced for the last couple of years in Congress. We need to see that reform win in the states so that we can generate the will for this in Washington to have a national bill. We also, there's same-day registration. There's early voting, where in too many states, like New York, don't have early voting. We've got to be able to enact affirmative piece of legislation in the states, again, on all of these things. I think also, to me, it's crazy that secretaries of state can both run as candidates and oversee elections. Seems like an obvious thing that, like, maybe we want to have a conflict of interest law with the secretaries of state. So there's a number of ways in which we actually need to open these doors up into voting, while litigators and the civil rights litigators that are in the coalition are fighting after people, to ensure that votes don't get suppressed. The problem with litigation is that it happens after elections have taken place, and voters have lost the right to vote, and it takes years to litigate. That's why at the Justice Department, having the voting rights pre-clearance jurisdiction was so important, and we need to restore that. There is no question in my mind that we need to make sure that jurisdictions that have a history of racial discrimination in voting have to have some kind of pre-clearance regime, and we need to restore the Voting Rights Act for that. It is not the only answer, as Derek said. We've got to see this range of reforms enacted. But I think that we forget that actually in the states there is this momentum, and I think all of you are doing such important state-based work, and I would hope to see that you guys really go strong on the democracy agenda. Florida now, I gotta tell you, 5 years ago, it was like impossible to think that the state of Florida would restore voting rights to people who had served out their sentences. That's where we are, and we've got to now use this and leverage it to change the game in states around the country. Many states have these restrictive laws, and they have them in different permutations. So all of you should find out, what is your state doing? What can we do? Not all of them are going to have ballot initiatives, but now there may be state legislatures more willing to take this on. And so this is all part of the menu of reforms that we need to go hard on, even while we fight the long game here in Washington.
Fantastic, so helpful, because as a reminder, we operate our synagogues on a local level, on a state level, and on a federal level all at once, trying to build up our leadership to be able to be impactful in all those levels, always in a nonpartisan way around issues and values, so you can help us think through what makes sense on a federal level, but what makes more sense on a local level. I just want to acknowledge also Harry Kaufman from the great state of Florida, who came running to me with this before I'd ever heard of the ballot initiative in Florida. He said, "You've got to see this. This is going to bring our movement together." And Harry was right. And we were so proud of how many Jews engaged in that campaign.
And can I just say, the one thing about Florida, which was amazing, we have to lift up the leadership of Desmond Meade and others who were...
Can we celebrate Desmond Meade? We love Desmond Meade. Oh, we love Desmond.
And the leadership of people who've been directly impacted, I think, is something that as a movement we need to give more and more space to. But he was there on the leadership conference, started meeting with him about 3 years ago when nobody was giving Desmond any money or any kind of time of day. And there were a little cohort of folks who really believed in what he was doing and were with him by his side like 3 years ago as he was building the blocks and building out his leadership. And it's something that I think now we need to seed all over the country.
Yeah, it was a great learning for us about allyship.
Yeah.
Desmond actually tweeted out a 30-second thank you video to the Reform Movement, which we treasure that clip.
Right.
So I want to walk through a couple of other issues, but again, thinking about like where the levers are. So criminal justice reform, something that the Reform Jewish Movement has really tried to have an impact on. After the last election, really going local and trying to act with local law enforcement, local district attorneys. What opportunities might there be with this new Congress? We're hearing things about maybe this administration doing something, even in a lame duck. Then, maybe to you first and then to Derek, what's possible in the next period?
Yeah, so there is, on the state level, all of you know that there's still a tremendous momentum, regardless of the awfulness and the kind of regressive policies out of this Justice Department. There is a lot of talk now about seeing a reform bill that will include sentencing reform, which for us at the Leadership Conference is really important in this Congress, and in the lame duck, I should say. And I know that we'll be working closely with you all, with the NAACP and others around this. Right now there's been a push, and Senator Durbin has led it, around trying to make sure that sentencing reform, meaningful sentencing reform, is part of any federal bill. Our three organizations represented here had been very concerned about a bill last spring that did not contain any sentencing reform, that had only back-end reform, and that had some problematic elements to it. And while we all know that change is often made incrementally, sometimes in criminal justice reform, there's a lot of words on a page that can seem like it's in the direction of reform, but actually is fairly meaningless, or it can really diffuse the momentum in a way that is not helpful. What I am now hearing about the bill that folks are working on is that it will be something that will hopefully contain, finally, retroactivity for crack cocaine sentencing, for the Fair Sentencing Act, which passed, as you all know, in 2010, but was only prospective. There's a number of different elements of that bill that we are going to be working on really hard to make sure that if it truly is a bill that will have a meaningful impact in the federal system, which is not, it's the largest of all of it's larger than any state system, but percentage-wise is about 14 to 15%, represents 14 to 15% of all people incarcerated in this country. If it really is a meaningful bill, then I think we want to get behind it. But that calculus is going to be made in coalition, because we know that a lot of games can be played as this stuff goes through the sausage making. But, and so we'll work together on it, but this is an opportunity, if it's real, to advance something at the federal level, but do not lose sight of all of the momentum at the state level, because we need you all to keep pushing, to work in coalition with groups on the ground. There's a lot more momentum, frankly, in the states than there is federally, and so we want to keep pushing forward.
Fantastic.
I absolutely agree. I mean, the momentum is really state-based. And much of the problem is really state-based. And so the DA movement is something I've been really proud to watch as more progressive DA get elected. The movement really kicked off in 2015. I predict by 2020 there's going to be tremendous momentum in Harris County, Texas. When I was in law school there, it had the second highest per capita in terms of individuals being put on death row of any other state. This county was second to states. Fortunately, last year they elected a progressive DA. This election cycle, they elected 17 progressive judges. So that will really change what takes place in Harris County, Texas. And the progressive movement in the whole criminal justice space on a state level, once that pick up momentum, I believe we're going to begin to see a real shift in how we look at criminal justice reform, state-based up.
Great, thank you for that. So one of the most heartening parts of this election for us was the student leadership around gun violence prevention. And you know, we had student leaders across the country really organizing their networks and peers. What do you see ahead in what's possible? Obviously, a lot of seats shifted from people who got high rankings from the NRA now to people who get proudly Fs from the NRA. Can we see something happening in the next Congress, or is it again going to still be state ballot initiatives, other local?
I believe the state ballot initiative. I think the NRA, first of all, I think they removed the grading. So many people are so proud of their F. I think they removed the grading. The stranglehold they have on the Senate, I don't see that changing much at all. Unfortunately, they have a stranglehold in both parties, and particularly in rural southern states and in rural states out west. And so I don't see much changing with that unless it is through ballot initiatives.
I agree with Derek. I mean, I do think that the youth activism is something that we need to harness, and we saw it, and it's very strong in the gun safety movement now. But you know, I was so inspired last year also by Dreamers and the youth-led movement of Dreamers, who there was a whole grassroots effort by Dreamers who can't vote, doing the door knocking on doors saying, get out there and vote your values. We can't vote for us, vote for our protection and for our future. And I thought that was incredibly inspiring. And on the gun safety issues, I mean, the NRA remains still one of the most effective and feared lobbying powers. We are seeing a change in the conversation, and it's just, you know, mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting. I don't know, I mean, honestly, I don't know what it's going to take to kind of break and the kind of culture hole that the NRA does have on trying to get some common sense gun measures passed. But I think maybe it is these state ballot initiatives, and I think the activism needs to continue. Again, it needs to be coalitional. And I think that when the young people who've always led the most important movements in our country refuse to accept the status quo and refuse to be cynical about what for too long has been accepted in this country, I don't think that they're going to stop. And unfortunately, I don't see the mass shootings stopping either. And so now it will be on all of us to try to find ways to back this up with actual common sense gun reform. And so we'll see what happens now. I thought it was pretty amazing. Donna Shalala, who got graded an F in Florida, you know, is then elected. I mean, candidate after candidate after candidate who was graded F gets elected, and that felt like it was not possible a couple of years ago. So we are seeing some change.
And every 2 years, there'll be a wave of more student voters who join the rolls. I want to ask the leadership, our student leaders who are here in the room, to stand up and be recognized, even as we have this conversation. I see Adam, I see Jeremy Cronin. I am deeply moved by our student leaders who are all standing and being recognized. You can sit down now, thank you. They can't see you on the live stream. Catherine Fleischer, who I was with in Pittsburgh in the hours after the shooting, asked the question. She's a student at the University of Pittsburgh, one of our former president of our youth movement, asked tearfully, after Parkland has nothing changed.
Yeah.
And I think a whole generation is crying out like the blood of our brothers from the earth, saying has nothing changed. So hopefully the activism continues, the organizing continues, and this will become a movement that will win.
And to me, what was really important and powerful about the Parkland students is they recognized that while they were getting a ton of media attention, that the violence for Black and brown youth, which had been going on and has been going on in city after city, that they knew that they wanted to build a cross-racial, cross-faith movement for gun safety. And I think that's on all of you, the young people, to build those coalitions. Because as I said, we don't win in this country unless those coalitions get built. And I think young people really understand that.
Yeah, but I want to add, we also, from the progressive movement, need to recognize the difference between protest and power.
Yep.
It's great to protest, but if that's not translated to power through the vote, then it's a lot of noise. So we have to move beyond the noise and really get to the place where our young people understand the value of their vote and their voice. And so the protest must go directly to the polls. And we have to stay focused on that.
My hope and prayer is that there were so many successes in this election that young people discovered their power, and that will then lead them to want to have more,
So,
build more.
and I think that's right. But to Derek's point, I think that we don't end by voting, right? We now have to hold our elected officials, whether they're of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, accountable for pursuing the kind of civil rights and human rights agenda that we believe we elected them for. And so that work is all ongoing. That's the work of the Leadership Conference, it's the work of the NAACP, it's the work of the Religious Action, to make sure that we are also in the work of pressing forward on the policy reforms that we believe in.
So, Benita, you raised immigration reform and Dreamers. We're all in on what we thought was going to be a campaign to win the Clean Dream Act. Of course, that didn't happen. What do you think the opportunities are now with this Congress and potentially things shifting? There's still a vilification and demonization of the other, the migrant, the asylum seeker. But do you think there's any hope for change in the next period of time?
I'm a civil rights lawyer, so I always think that there's hope for change, because otherwise none of us...
I'm a rabbi, so that's a good
right. None of us can be doing this work unless... But look, I think the anti-immigrant demonization that you refer to, it's been pretty horrific. And in this country we go through cycles of this, and the lead up to the midterms with the caravan stuff, which suddenly has vanished off of the front page of any newspaper, as you know. And I think the media had a role to play in all of that too. But the constant demonization of immigrants, I don't think we're going to see that go away. I think that because now, we're in a presidential cycle, it could get worse before it gets better. But that said, I think that there is a lot of potential for some basic immigration reform to happen. We still need to protect dreamers. They are at limbo. There are cases around the country that are percolating through the courts, and we don't know ultimately what the Supreme Court is going to do given the changed composition. And so there is still a push. We know that the president still wants to see his border wall. A lot of people say, well, gosh, let him build the wall as long as there isn't greater funding for interior enforcement. And there are going to probably have to be some difficult choices that the progressive community is going to need to make to try to have smart reforms passed in Congress to protect the most vulnerable among us, while kind of giving the president some kind of deal that will be the least harmful of all the options. Now, that sounds terrible, but this is the reality of the world that we live in, and we have to figure out what that looks like, and that will be a conversation that we will be having through the course of the next couple of years. But there has been the cutbacks on trying to redefine who can receive asylum in this country. There are things that are being done that actually, even by law, they were challenged when the president tried to do that this week to create an executive order to prevent and change asylum law through executive order. That was challenged within 24 hours by 3 major organizations that I believe are going to win. But we're going to keep seeing this happen. We're going to need to be vigilant and remember that there are going to be really important efforts to protect dreamers, to ensure that TPS holders are not just returned or that the policy isn't cut back. There's tons of really regressive policies that Jeff Sessions had led in the Justice Department, and now we're going to see what happens at the Justice Department, who replaces him, and have to be really vigilant about creating these cross-faith, cross-racial coalitions so that folks in government can't divide our communities, and that we stand together to support and protect immigrants in this country.
Anything to add about refugees, as this administration has tried to really, just limit the number of refugees that we take, which would then eviscerate the whole refugee
Look,
sector?
I gotta tell you that I think the faith communities and faith organizations are the most crucial voice in that fight. And to me, that your voices and being out there with African American leaders, with Mexican American leaders, that this is where the coalition, but where faith groups probably most importantly can be the face of this. There's a lot in the business community that are coming out on this. We need a wide coalition of unlikely allies to be standing firm. We are, my husband was a refugee. That's how he came into this country. The numbers right now are at an all-time low. And they're really redefining who we are in the world around these issues. And that's why we've got to fight now as leaders on the outside to kind of press forward on the values we want.
And, before you came in the room, we dedicated some of our work to the victims of the shooting in Pittsburgh, and we remembered them. Of course, we also remember that it was a synagogue that was targeted because they were highest synagogue that was committed to refugees and to welcome and acknowledge that only 2 days before it would have been a church. And so, as you said, we are really in this together. I want to shift a little bit, just for the sake of time. We know that climate change is, when it wreaks havoc, and there are fires burning in California now, and floods and all of that, communities of color and poor communities are disproportionately impacted. To what extent do you all see the civil rights community kind of rallying around climate change as a seminal issue, not only in stewardship of our sacred earth, but also as an economic and civil rights issue?
For us, it's huge. We just created a whole department around environmental justice. It's probably have more staff in that program now than any of our programs. It sits in an intersection of everything that we do, whether it's education, children going to buildings that are toxic and sick, Flint water crisis, everything as we look at civil rights movement moving forward is centered in the environmental justice movement. Climate change will really impact African Americans, particularly in the rural South, where a lot of toxic dumping is taking place. It's oftentimes the communities of least resistance. We have a nuclear reactor plant in Port Gibson, Mississippi. They were considered a second reactor, and the highways that was promised for evacuation had not even been completed. So we know that as we move forward, this is the central civil rights questions of the day, because it intersects everything we do. We'll go back briefly to the question around the immigration reform and the DREAM Act. The construct of race has always been an issue that has plagued this country. And defining the otherness is the #1 driver of the conservative movement in terms of voting. It's going to get worse over the next 2 years. It's not going to get better. I predict there will not be a true bill to come out of this Congress because they need otherness. They need fear to run out their base. For many of us, message of hope is the winning message. But if we don't have a message of hope, the fear message always prevails. And as we look at the current political landscape, the otherness of immigrants coming in and invading the borders with babies and children and having new babies was the thing that they're selling. But the thing that's most scary is the call for the Constitutional Convention. We have 28 states have already signed up.
We have to give folks some background.
Right? So there is an ongoing movement to open up the U.S. Constitution to do some redrafting. Right? The 14th Amendment, the definition of a citizenship, is in the center of that conversation. 28 states have already signed up calling for a constitutional convention. So in the background of all of the noise we're hearing, there are some real moves to redefine citizenship and identify a whole group of people of other. And so, the debate is taking place, and you have the march of the refugees coming to the border. But outside of all that noise, there's some serious efforts to change the definition of citizenship in this country. And if we're not careful, it's going to be upon us. And if they are able to convene a body to redraft our Constitution, we have to be prepared. And I submit today we're not prepared because they've been working on this for 20 years now.
One last question for me, and then I think we're going to hear some questions from the room. LGBTQ equality. The trans ballot initiative in Massachusetts, historic and important. I think the LGBTQ community has not felt this vulnerable in a long time. I'm wondering what you all are seeing and what we can be doing in the Reformed Jewish movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very much true. There was obviously so much momentum behind the fight for same-sex marriage, and then a fight to really break down discrimination barriers. A lot of our civil rights laws still, to this day, do not protect people on the basis of sexual orientation, and so there's going to be a push on the Equality Act in Congress to rectify that. But right now, I would say that across the federal agencies led by the Department of Justice, there's been a push to use religion as a sword to prevent or to allow for folks to say that it's against my religion to serve an LGBT individual, and this was in the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision from the Supreme Court that was put to test. We are seeing now federal policies to change the protections of federal employees, LGBT federal employees, and to be able to use religion as this kind of sword to defeat anti-discrimination principles. And so we've got a lot of work to do, and I think that this isn't going to stop anytime soon. In fact, it's gearing up right now, and we will continue to see challenges, but this is where I think cross-faith coalitions are going to be really important voices. We've got to make sure that there was the anti-discrimination principles have been a part of our country since the Pickey Park decision in the late 60s, which that was a case in South Carolina where the owner of a Pickey Park restaurant said, well, it was against my religion it didn't want to serve integrated customers, black and white customers in South Carolina. And the Supreme Court held very strongly that you couldn't use religion to bypass anti-discrimination laws. But there is now this growing chorus of people, both in the judiciary, which is the courts are getting packed, and we can talk about that soon too, but to basically create this exception for people who believe that it is against their religion to serve LGBTQ people. And so the danger will be that this will get somehow enacted in law, and that is why there's been a push to have the Equality Act become part of our legal landscape so that the courts can't undo it and so that political appointees can't undo this. And we know that the culture has changed. We've seen a dramatic shift that has really been grassroots and movement-based in this country around changing cultural perceptions. I think young people are kind of leaps and bounds ahead of the rest of the country on this, and we've got to lift up and continue the fight for dignity and equality for the LGBTQ community, even as we do it on everything else that we do.
Equality Act, do you think it has a chance at this time?
You know, I think that my guess is it will pass the House and that it'll remain to be seen. I think that there will be a number of senators from both parties, including Republican senators, that may champion it. So I think there are very few things that I think I could feel confident about having mentioned bipartisan support. Criminal justice reform is one of them, and maybe the Equality Act. And we need to make sure, though, that to the extent the Equality Act can reopen landmark civil rights legislation for which people fought, bled in the streets for, that there is nothing to affect the status quo of protections in that legislation, because otherwise we need to pull it back. But to the extent that we can add to the protections in that legislation, I think that we want to. We just need to make sure that nothing nefarious is done with the existing landmark legislative protections that we have come to accept as part of the normal kind of course of our country now.
I think the biggest concern I have with all of our issues, particularly this, is the packing of the federal courts. 142 vacancies out of 865. That's the fight over the next 2 years. Because as much as they can, they're going to try to stack the court, knowing that 2020 reality may not be as favorable as this past election in terms of the Senate. So that's going to be the biggest fight. And much of our concerns are going to be felt right there. In terms of LGBT and the case that Benita talked about, there are several cases on the way to the Supreme Court now. The case out of North Carolina, the case out of Texas, the case out of Mississippi, all dealing with the same issue around someone's deeply held religious belief of should they serve one set of individuals compared to another set of individuals. Those cases are making their way to the Supreme Court. I'm most concerned about the judiciary than anything else.
Is there a strategy, Derek, around that? If the if the administration is going to nominate its judges, they have the Senate. What would the strategy be?
It's hard. I mean, we just seen it with the Capitol here. When you have that level of power, you control the Senate, you have the White House, you appoint, you confirm, you seat. I mean, it's not a lot that I'm aware of, but I'm just a local guy who's a grassroots organizer who don't know all the smart stuff. I mean,
no, there is, and Derek is like, oh, I'm just a country bumpkin, which is like the exact opposite of the truth. And the NAACP and the Religious Action Center really did yeoman's work in the Kavanaugh fight, and I'm deeply appreciative. The leadership conference was charging hard on exposing Kavanaugh's record. We are where we are, but I think I don't want to have anyone take away. The struggle was really important, and it was an important fight to educate the public about what was at stake with the Supreme Court vacancy. We could see another Supreme Court vacancy this year, and we need to do a better job as civil and human rights voters and people who care about civil and human rights on educating progressives about the courts. The other side has been at this planning, building out infrastructure. They are 30 or 40 years ahead of us, and I think now we are at a tipping point where the courts, which we have largely taken for granted that they would be a backstop to some of the most egregious excesses of the other branches of government, we are coming to a point where that may not be the case anymore. And so there is, look, the Senate makeup is what it is, but even in the last year, we were able to defeat certain nominees when videotapes came up of prior speeches that they had made, calling transgender children the spawn of Satan was one of the nominees. We have nominees now where the needle has moved so much. Nominees who are literally before the Senate Judiciary Committee refusing to say that Brown versus Board of Education was correctly decided. Okay, we now have a fake acting attorney general who is saying that Marbury versus Madison was a bad decision. I mean, the norms are getting kind of broken, and we just need to say that that's not acceptable. There are certain decisions in this country that should be untouchable, irreversible, that are so much a part of our core democratic principles of being in the United States that those cannot be. But the fight has been, we've got to kind of throw sand in the gears, but make sure that the American public knows the full breadth of a person's record when appearing before the committee. And it will be, there have been times where Senator Tim Scott then led the charge on defeating Ryan Bounds, his nomination to the Ninth Circuit, because of writings that really depicted strong racial bias and other bigoted views. And so, you just never know where the wins happen, but it is usually because something about a person's record is just finally deemed too extreme. But I am very deeply concerned about what is going to happen with the courts and what are not only us, but our children and our children's children will be living with in terms of a court and courts all over the country that are no longer the kind of backstop. And we have to forge forward and build, as I said, public will and power for educating people about why the courts matter. They touch every decision and every aspect of our lives. And this is one where we're going to have to play the long game.
Yeah, I will say go ahead.
And our advocacy targets may have to shift. Probably would need to be the media. So they stop making illogical, lying behavior normal. We have to address the vehicles of the message, because the type of things that are so far out of the norm, they're truly being normalized by mass media, not just Fox News. Anytime you watch CNN, they create false equivalency, and then the reporting is a ping pong. He said this, they said that. That's out of whack. And so some of our advocacy targets may need to be mainstream media so we can bring a level of veracity back into the conversation.
Very helpful. And while we're on judicial nominations, I will say for the record, not only are we the largest and most diverse movement of Judaism, Our diversity isn't only that we're multiracial and LGBT inclusive and diverse in every way, we're politically diverse. We have political conservatives and we have political liberals. The one issue that is most divisive in our movement is judicial nominations, where I appreciate your comments about Kavanaugh. I would say the Kavanaugh process was the most challenging issue that we worked on this year. Around immigration, criminal justice reform, voting rights, our movement stays pretty closely together, even with thoughtful dissent. Around judicial nominations, it becomes very complicated for us.
Yeah.
Let me go to a few of the questions that we got, from excellent questions from the crowd. I'm going to read all three, and then you can kind of think about which ones you want to take and how deeply. This is, I think, mostly to Derek, but to the two. You both have mentioned the importance of building coalitions. How do we best do that, specifically in this context, between congregations and NAACP chapters, and maybe coalition chapters as well? So one is coalition building locally. Second is, what can we do about Congress addressing white supremacy and anti-Semitism? Third, with a Republican Senate and a Democratic House, are there any non- or bipartisan issues in which we can work together? Obviously, we need to started to get at that with the Equality Act and with criminal justice reform. What do we think could be accomplished in Congress? Maybe you already answered that question, but so who wants to go first?
Well, coalition building for me is always simple. Identify the things that we agree on and aggressively work on those things. One of the problems we have in the progressive movement, we all have 1,000 beliefs on what's going to get us to the promised land. And we're trying to take all 1,000 routes to get there, when in fact we need to be looking at a set of 3 to 4 things that we can agree on that's paramount to make democracy work, and aggressively work on those things with a long view. When I took over this position, I recognized the transactional nature we were having in terms of the policy issues we were taking on, in terms of the relationships that we're engaging in, and that transactional behavior was very short term. And for us, it's a 5-year arc. How do we make democracy work over the next 5 years? Understanding we just came out of a midterm election, next year's census, followed by presidential and congressional elections, followed by redistricting back to midterm elections. That's the arc of our opportunity. How do we, in a coalition, really maximize that across political perspective? If we care about democracy, it's around access, accuracy in the information that we're receiving and displaying, and to ensure that everyone can really, really participate. That's where we can really lean in on democracy. Next year's census count will be paramount in so many ways. And what I've recognized, the opposition, however we define opposition, data is their enemy. They don't want accurate information. We must really rely on factual, accurate information through the census count and figure out as a coalition, and Benita head up one of the tables, how do we really, in locale by locale, activate our places of worship, our organizations, and individuals to ensure a fair census count.
Yeah, Derek, thank you for bringing up the census, because we've talked just on the bipartisan opportunities. In 2020 will be the next count. And every 10 years, this country, by virtue of the Constitution, is mandated to do a count of every single human being within our borders. And there is a push now to get the citizenship question off of the census out of concern that because it was added, and now litigation has revealed that Steve Bannon had been very much behind that, the push to have Secretary Ross of the Commerce Department add that question, that there's litigation to try to undo it, and there will be a legislative strategy. But regardless of where that comes out, we need people in communities all over the country to be trusted messengers to get people to be counted in 2020. There is so much that rides on it. Political apportionment, it's one of the core Democratic, and probably I would say the least sexy civil rights issue in a certain way, and yet is so core to our democracy. So political apportionment, but then also how the federal government doles out over $800 billion of money is determined by the census count. And it's going to be happening in a presidential year. And so as we continue to do civic engagement, voter engagement, we want to make sure that we are also sending a message that in April of 2020 that everyone should be counted. And that should be a bipartisan, cross-faith, cross-racial using every institution and convening space that we have. It will require an all-hands-on-deck effort, given the level of fear in certain communities right now about reporting anything to the federal government. There are some strict laws on the books about how census data can be used, but we know that the level of fear is high, and so we'll need everyone to be engaged on that. On the coalition side, I think you all are doing the coalition work. I think by virtue of what you do in your communities is so important. Obviously, Derek and the NAACP chapters are in every single community in the country, but this I call them like kind of the local leadership conference tables, where you're bringing together like all of the groups locally in your communities that have a stake in a particular issue, and that's organizing. And it just comes down to relationships, building those relationships, doing that hard work and sustaining them through thick and thin, being there for each other through thick and thin, and then being able to do that. Look, on the white supremacy and anti-Semitism front, I think that we have a really great challenge. We know that these are not kind of new phenomena in this country, but they have certainly been forces that have been emboldened in the last couple of years. And to me, frankly, again, it comes down to organizing, teaching our kids in schools about what's acceptable, what isn't, but also modeling through local organizing and building those coalitions. It's all kind of related. We know that there are things that certainly at the federal government level, you know, when I was in the Justice Department, there was a lot of effort put to building out trainings for local law enforcement to make sure that they knew how to investigate hate crimes, that people had the trust in local communities about reporting hate crimes. 88% of jurisdictions in this country still report either zero hate crimes or do not report at all. We've got a huge data challenge, so Congress can certainly do things to mandate accurate data collection that can send a message about the need to fight bigotry and acts of violence in that front. But fundamentally, changing attitudes and hearts and minds comes down to what we do in our communities for the models that we set.
We would never be able to weave out white supremacy from Congress unless we change individuals who hold the seats. It is both the fuel and the tool they use to maintain power. When you have individuals, conveniently the senator out of South Carolina, who will speak perfectly against some of the foolishness of the White House, and then in the next sentence, empower white supremacist notions of what should be acceptable or not. It is both the fuel and the tool, and anytime you will see the election approaching, and particular geographies, they will send the right code, message, and words so they can generate interest to turn people out to vote. We must change the composition of many individuals who hold seats in Congress, particularly the Senate, because Southern senators and actually across the country, they use it as their tool to stay in power or the fuel to turn out their vote.
Amazing. I will say, in the wake of Pittsburgh, it has been incredible. I was there on the ground to see the way in which the Muslim community, the Christian community, communities of color, white community, all came together in Pittsburgh, and they said about themselves, "This is Pittsburgh." And internally, yeah.
Have you shown folks here the ad that we did in the New York Times? That was,
no, we haven't, but we will.
Oh,
we'll put it up on the screen.
Yeah.
Very proud to
I
be
mean, that
part
was
of
at the national level, because I think locally, as you're saying, it was happening in communities all over the country. But the leadership conference, it was about 87 groups that signed on in solidarity with the Pittsburgh communities, in solidarity with what had happened in Louisville earlier that week. But you know, again, using every time, I mean, we don't want to be reactive to this, and that's the proactive work, I think, is the local organizing and solidarity building that we do to prevent these kinds of incidents.
And in the spirit of change begins at home, we've also tried to do some internal confrontation with our own patterns of white supremacy and racism, even within our own synagogues, where we're hearing from Jews of color who are saying, not only are we doubly targeted as people of color and as Jews, but now we're getting profiled going into our own synagogues because of security. And so how do we actually model the kind of just and confrontation with racism communities that we want to live in? Let's take a second and think about economic justice. Living wage, we've seen a real grassroots movement on living wage. Are there other areas where we might see some opportunities with either this Congress or on a state level to kind of advance the common good through economic justice?
I mean, I think we saw a number of states, as I said, expand Medicaid coverage in this election, and I think that there is potential to see that in communities around the country. The momentum for ensuring that everyone's healthcare has access to healthcare is a really big driver. It was a huge driver in this election, and we need to ensure that momentum continues. It's a core economic security issue. I kind of view so much of what we've already been talking about as core to economic security. We're still pushing for educational equity in communities around the country there are too many communities that have deeply segregated schools and lack of access to resources to actually provide for good schools. That remains a charge of the leadership conference as well. All of these issues, I think they're state fights, and they're longer game of doing the work federally. I don't know if...
Yeah, I think what's bubbling on the state level is our infrastructure needs. I think there's going to be, it's a pressure cooker now because our roads, our bridges, our overall infrastructure, they're all in such dire need of upgrades and improvements. And so the whole tax policy conversation is going to reemerge. We simply don't have the money to address it. I think with this new Congress, there's going to be more pressure from states, both Republican and Democratic states, on how to solve the infrastructure needs, and that could create more jobs that are so direly needed across the country.
Great. So as we come to a close, I'd love to invite you both to offer some closing reflections. First, anything you want is your closing reflection, but also, what gives you the most hope? What gives you the most fear? And maybe you could do the fear first and then, and then leave us with hope. So any closing reflections you have, what are you concerned about, but what gives you hope?
I think what I fear the most is that some of what we've been seeing in terms of the rise of hate and the divisiveness, the lack of civility, that somehow all of this becomes normalized and legitimized. And I think that will be one of the most dangerous things. I am very worried about what's happening to some of our core democratic institutions, things that we have taken for granted for so long that we know don't protect themselves. And yet what gives me hope is seeing millions and millions and millions of people who never before considered themselves activists, who may not have voted before in a midterm election, who came out because, when the Muslim ban happened, it wasn't just Muslims rushing to the airport. It was people of all stripes and faiths, because out of love of this country and out of love of what we believe American values and ideals to be. And that's what gives me hope. It's all of you. It's all of the organizing that's happening in communities around the country. We have to continue to forge forward with that. I think cynicism is the enemy of justice. I think despair is the enemy of justice, and that's why we have to kind of embody the hope that we want and continue to organize in our communities for the kind of world and community that we want to see all over the country.
Are we committed to that? Yes, we sure are.
In terms of fear, the current level of tribalism that you see across the country, it is at an extremely high. The undermining of our institutions, it's an ongoing effort. And too many of us assume that the democracy that we rely on will be the democracy we will have in the future. I'm really concerned about that. In terms of the youth activism that we're seeing across the country, that is inspiring. Our young activists today are our leaders tomorrow. When I take the position, people say, well, what do you think about NACP and how does that relate to the movement for Black Lives? What are you going to do with them? I said, I'm going to love them. I'm going to hug them. I'm going to support them, because no matter what vehicle young people choose in terms of their voice, we need their voice. Because their voice can be informed over time, can impact our outcomes. But the level of energy that we're seeing across the country, it is a beautiful amount of energy to try to protect what we have grown accustomed to. And the momentum that's coming out of that is really, really good for us to really harness and continue to harness and ride through 2019 and all the way to 2020. We are nonpartisan, just like the RAC. We have members of our board who affiliate with different political parties. African Americans, though, we are 92% in the same party all the time, but we do have those alternative voices. And those voices are welcome at the table, because some of the things that they are bringing to the table are valuable insights on how we operationalize what we do on the ground, while at the same time, we know African Americans, we're not a monolith no more than the Jewish community is a monolith. But the very institutions we stand on must be protected despite our views on tax policy. Because for us, for me particularly, this democracy is about who gets taxed, who's not taxed, and how we decide to spend the tax dollars. That's in the center of the debate. And if we can have a civil debate around those questions, we will have a healthy democracy. But if we completely undermine the very institutions that give us the platform for the discourse, then I am most fearful, but the hope overshadows the fear for me every day.
Thank you so much. So let's celebrate President Derek Johnson, President Benita Gupta. Are you President Benita Gupta or CEO?
Both.
President and CEO, as is
But
my
meanwhile,
goal.
both of you are my board members, so you know.
Well, I do get to be on both your boards, which I have to say fills me with humility. Let me acknowledge, for the sake of history, that the partnership, the relationship between the NAACP, the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, now Civil and Human Rights, and the Reformed Jewish Movement began before any of the three of us were born.
That's correct.
And I think we're humbled as today's generation of leaders to be able to continue that partnership, to deepen that partnership. And so by closing with gratitude, I'd like to close with some prayer. And I'm going to ask Benita if I may take your hand, and Derek if I may take yours, and ask the people in the room to take hands with one another. I'm not going to stand because then we won't be in the view of the live stream, because at home we want you to pray as well. So I invite you to take a breath, have a moment of quiet, allow the inspiring and stirring words of Derek Johnson and Benita Gupta, two incredible and tireless champions for justice who are leading this country and this world to realize the promise and the potential of the nation and justice we aspire to be but are not yet. And so I offer these words of blessing for our brother Derek, our sister Benita. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, may God bless you and keep you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka, may God shine upon you and be good to you. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom, may you go forth hand in hand, not only with one another and with us, but with God in heaven above and on earth below, so that you may know and bring about shalom, peace. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining.